Hello, and welcome to FACT's webinar called Enticing Animals to Eat Unpalatable Plants. Our guest presenter today is Dr. Fred Provenza. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating the session. Thank you for being here. Before we dive right in, I do have a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust or FACT. We are a national nonprofit organization headquartered in Illinois. We work to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a healthy and humane manner. We accomplish this by supporting humane farmers such as yourselves, promoting policies that make food from animals safe and healthy to eat, and by helping consumers make informed food choices. My wonderful FACT colleague, Samantha, who you see on the screen, and I run FACT's Humane Farming Program, and we work with livestock and poultry farmers from all across the country. We do offer grants, scholarships, training courses, mentorship, and of course, webinars. I do want to give a quick plug that we are currently accepting applications for farmers interested in participating as mentors and mentees in our next mentorship program in 2023. The application deadline to apply is November 30th. So please visit our website at foodanimalconcerns.org to learn more about all of our farmer services. This time, I'm totally delighted to introduce our acclaimed presenter, Dr. Fred Provenza. Fred grew up in Colorado, working on a ranch while attending school in wildlife biology at Colorado State University. He's Professor Emeritus of Behavioral Ecology in the Department of Wildlife Resources at Utah State University, where he worked for 35 years, directing a research group that pioneered an understanding of learning, of how learning influences foraging behavior and how behavior links soil, plant, herbivores, and humans. He is the author of 3 books and hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. So it's a complete honor and delight to have him with us today so that he can share his vast experience and expertise. So I think without further ado, Fred, I'm going to turn the floor over to you so that you may get started.
Okay, Larissa. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with all of you folks. It's just an honor to be here with you. That's what I'd like to say. And so prior to this, Larissa was sharing some questions with me that folks had sent in. And I lumped them into 5 major categories: training livestock to eat plants. And as we go along, I want to talk about, some plants, certainly we can train animals to eat. Others that people sent in, plants, for instance, like poison ivy, bindweed, Canadian thistle, burdock, those to me are on the list of can certainly train animals to eat those kinds of plants. And we'll talk about that. There are others that people sent in: wild parsnip, woolly croton, yellow crownbeard, and so forth, that are pretty dang toxic plants. So a person has to be careful with how they approach that. But more on all of that as we go along. So training animals to eat plants was one major category. Timing of grazing, some very interesting questions related to timing of grazing. I'm going to make a big point of that as we go along here. In terms of ability of animals to eat plants, but not only that, the ability of them eating the plants to decrease the abundance of some plants that we don't want in the environment, or we'd like less of. Grazing management was another broad heading that fits with what I'll talk about. And then there were interesting questions about variety of different plants, the health of the animals, forcing animals to eat plants. Very important kind of issues and questions, and we'll touch on those too. Then there were questions that came under a broad heading of that I put a value of other plant species to have them in a mix. And that gets fairly local to your situation and the plant species that'll grow there. And so I'm going to talk about the value of diversity and how important I think that is in all of this. But then also, I want to say that if there are follow-up questions that people have that are specific to your place, in the end, it does all get really specific, as we'll talk about. I'm happy to interact with you either by phone or by email or combination to talk through some of the questions that you might have. So with that by way of background, let me share the screen here with you. Larissa, can you see that okay?
Yeah, yep, that looks good, Fred.
Okay, good, good. So as I was thinking about this topic and how to approach it, there's a couple of ways. One, I could just go through a whole list of plant species and talk about, the animals could be trained to eat this and that and the other. And but there's another way to approach it, and that is to talk about principles and processes of food selection. And then with that, talk about how to use that understanding of principle and process to get the kind of objectives that you want done. And so that's what I decided on, to do a blending of principle and process with practices related to this topic. So, over the 50 years or more that I've been involved in this and fascinated by it, it becomes obvious when you're working with goats, sheep, cattle, wildlife species like deer and elk and bison and so forth. And when you're studying plants, and the plants, of course, become fundamental to all of this, but you come to realize that there are huge challenges that animals face when they're out there attempting to select their diet. We look at them and we see them out there chewing their cud and going along grazing and think, well, it's, that's about as simple as it can get. But what you come to realize is that as you look across a landscape with different species, some of those species and plant parts, stems are different from leaves, are different from flowers and so forth. Some are nutritious, but others can be toxic. Where the challenge gets in even more is that individual plants can be nutritious or toxic depending on the time of the day, the week, and the season of the year, and on the resources available in the environment where a plant's growing. The same plant species, I've often had that and seen it in my own experience, can be quite palatable under one set of conditions, and animals don't want to touch it at all under another. And that has to do with moisture, the availability of moisture, nutrients, sunlight in the environment. So all those factors are in play, which makes it very complicated, but at the same time, that's where the possibilities to work with plants and animals to accomplish objectives comes in. So that's the flavor we're going to use today. So why do animals eat some plants and not others? I think broadly a person can use three categories. One is physical characteristics of the plants. And there was so much work done early on in my career by other groups simply showing that the structure of the plant influences how readily animals can eat it, and that influences choices that animals make. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about that today. I'll say just a little bit. I had planned originally to talk more and show some videos about animals with experience or not experience and how that can alter whether they eat a plant, but for sake of time, there's no way I would have made it all. So I'm not going to say a lot about physical characteristics. I am going to talk a lot about chemical characteristics of plants and experience or lack of experience and how that influences what animals are able to do. So the question for me over the years was, how do animals know what and what not to eat to meet their needs for nutrients, as well as self-medicate, given that they don't have nutritionists, pharmacists, veterinarians trained to tell them what to do? And that takes us into this notion of the wisdom of the body. And I'm going to use that as a unifying theme here, and then talk about three facets of that. One is social, cultural, transgenerational kind of linkages to landscape, so important in all of this. And in wherever you stand on changing climates and all the rest of that, over the last 20,000 years, climates have changed hugely. Plant species have moved all around the globe, and animals have had to adjust to that. And so the idea is that social cultural mechanisms allow them to become locally adapted to the environments they inhabit. So I want to start talking about that and give examples of how that can be used to enable animals to eat plants that we might think of as unpalatable or weedy or whatever. Then I'm going to move from there to this notion of flavor feedback relationships and talk a little bit about what that is, but then also how that can be used to alter liking for foods. And then based on those two, I'm going to end on this notion of variety and satiety and how diversity of different species and how we can work with diversity of different species can enable animals to do things that you'd think they could never do. So basically, that's where we're going. And I want to start out each one with a food for thought question. And I'm going to start actually with an example here from the Netherlands of some absolutely fascinating work with rabbits. And what they're trying to do is train these rabbits to eat milkweed, an invasive species in their environments. It's loaded with secondary compounds that can deter animals from eating it. And they started their work by pointing out, doing studies that showed that rabbits are learning what and what not to eat. They learn that socially. It starts in the womb as flavors, as I'll talk with livestock. Foods that mom's eating gets in the amniotic fluid, and the young animal starts to get acquainted with mom's diet. After that, mother's milk, and then fecal pellets that are left in the pen are also sources of information about diet. Now with milkweed, it gets, and they showed you can train rabbits to eat milkweed. They'll do it and do it readily. But the challenge is, under natural conditions, if you're going to encourage whole populations, is that rabbits are born in winter and early spring, the young pups. But milkweed doesn't grow until after the animals are already on their own. So a question is, how might young rabbits learn to eat milkweed independent of these direct influences that I'm talking about? How might they learn from mother still? But how could that take place, given that mom isn't going to be eating milkweed when she's pregnant? So that's a food for thought for you. There's been so much research over the years, amazing research, that shows that natal experiences influence food and habitat preferences, which I won't talk about the habitat part, but very important, in everything from insects to fish, birds, and mammals. If I had the time, I'd tell stories about every one of the creatures here on your screen. But let's just say that it becomes the home field advantage, these natal experiences, learning what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. When you start reading about it, it's fascinating, and it makes perfect sense that these things would happen. It's how animals don't come just genetically, innately knowing all these things. That learning is important because environments are constantly changing. So it shouldn't have been a surprise, I guess, to us as we went along studying goats, sheep, and cattle, that learning is so important in terms of both food and habitat selection. The learning begins in the womb, as I was saying, for the rabbits, then continues as flavors in mom's diet get into her milk, and then mother serves as a model once the young animals are born. And I'm going to show you a short video just to try to make this come alive a little bit for you, of things that we did where we were showing how readily these young animals learn what and what not to eat from mother.
Instead of their normal morning meal, these ewes and their lambs are being offered a meal of Russian olive and carrageenan. Ewes are familiar with both shrubs, but after eating carrageenan, they received a bolus of lithium chloride. This caused nausea and an aversion to carrageenan. The lambs have no experience with either plant, so they choose to eat what mom eats. After eating the shrubs with their mothers each morning for 5 days, the lambs are put into the pen without their mothers. Because they have experience from eating with mom and from positive feedback from the nutrients in Russian olive, they stick to what mom ate and avoid what she avoided. This second set of ewes are averted to Russian olive but eat carrageenan. After exposure to the shrubs, the lambs are sent in to graze without their mothers. Again, they choose to eat what mom ate. For the final morning of the demonstration, both groups of lambs enter the pen to a choice of Russian olive and carrageenan. Our theory is that the lambs whose mothers ate Russian olive will continue to eat Russian olive, and those whose mothers ate carrageenan will eat carrageenan. We've placed C's on the backs of the lambs who should eat carrageenan to help you track their progress. Lambs not marked with C's should eat Russian olive. In just a short time, the lambs separate into the groups representing the foods that their mothers ate. In the process, they try the other food. This is only one of a number of studies showing that an animal's mother is the single most important factor in determining what foods it eats and where it lives. It also demonstrates how young animals try new foods based on what they see their herd mates eating.
So let's build on that a little bit and reinforce some of the points. When I think about mother and offspring, I think of mother as being a transgenerational link to landscapes. Her knowledge of what and what not to eat is fundamental to helping the young animals get started. And as you saw in that video, they're paying attention to what mother's doing, but they're also sampling things. Young animals are curious. They're curious, but they're cautious, and they sample new things. And as Kathy both was pointing out in that video, watching what their peers do is a really important influence, especially for young animals, for adults as well. So offspring, mother adds stability, offspring add creativity. You know, we saw that in some work that we got involved with people in Washington State years ago. And they had set up a project on forest plantations where a band of sheep, of 1,000 sheep, they were forest grazing in these plantations with the young conifer seedlings. And the idea was for the ewes to eat the grasses and forbs, but definitely to leave the conifer seedlings alone. And in so doing, the idea was that they would reduce competition for moisture, nutrients, and sunlight, and thus enhance the growth of the conifer seedlings. Well, the first year they did it, it worked like a charm. The ewes and lambs ate the understory, left the trees alone. The next year when they came in, for whatever reason, and we'll wind our way back to this at the very end, the lambs started to eat, when the conifers had a flush of new growth, the lambs started to sample that new growth. And it was nutritious, so pretty soon all the lambs are eating, but by the end of the season, the ewes were eating too. So the lambs had retrained the ewes, this huge value of social influence, and it relates to weeds as well. The lambs had retrained the ewes to eat the seedlings. The third year, when they put the ewes in, the ewes started eating the conifers immediately, and they were then training the lambs. So the lambs trained the ewes in year 2, the ewes then were training the lambs in year 3, this transgenerational kind of influence, and pointing out how important social influences are, and how if you can get animals that eat weeds that you want and get them as a part of your herd, more on this as we go, they can train other animals in the herd. And a point I want to make here is that old dogs can learn new tricks. Older animals are more reluctant to change. And I'm thinking of studies with goats that show where they moved goats to places, goats from 4 different islands to one island that had species that were contained on all the other islands, and how the old mature goats never did change their dietary habits. They stuck with what was familiar. It was the younger animals that were learning. So, but old dogs can learn new tricks. Young dogs learn them quicker. age and challenge influence how quickly animals can learn. We'll get into that more as we're going along. But so what's mom doing? Mom's helping these young animals to become familiar with a particular food. Then, as I'm saying, they sample unfamiliar foods. They'll sample foods that mother isn't eating. But if nutritional state is adequate, familiarity, if they're familiar with something, breeds content. They stick with what they know. Novelty breeds contempt. And animals are what we call neophobic. So you offer a novel food, and this goes for ewes and lambs and calves and cows and kids and moms. What we see all the time, whether we're dealing with, I'm showing you with rice here, but we did it, and I deleted some of these slides for sake of time. We did it with forage plants and so forth. If they've never seen it before, they don't eat a lot right off the bat. They sample it. And if the consequences are good, they'll increase their intake of that food. If you change the flavor, and I could show you some really interesting examples where plant species change the flavor and they drop off. So this is cautious. This is what keeps them from being poisoned on plants that might be harmful. So they're typically not eating just one food in a meal, and we showed in our studies, in this case here, barley, oats, alfalfa, and corn were familiar foods, and we gave the lambs, in this case here, a meal of all four of those familiar foods and one novel food, rye. And after that meal, we gave them a mild dose of this lithium chloride that Kathy talked about in the video. It induces mild nausea in animals. And then looked at what they did. The next day, they avoid the novel food, not the familiar food. So I'm just trying to make it make sense how the role that mother plays, and then the cautious sampling, and how animals are behaving. Now, we did it also where if animals are deficient or needing something in their diet, and you offer them a novel food on day one, and you follow that with a nutrient boost of the nutrient they're lacking, on the subsequent days, their intake of that novel food goes up, not down. So it's very functional the way that they're doing that. So you have novel foods. Novelty, unfamiliarity is something that's important as animals are foraging. Think of yourself. You're going in the grocery store. There are 100, 600, 700,000 items there. We don't select every item in the store. There's things that we know and we become familiar with, and at the stores I go to often, there are people in the aisles that are trying to get you to sample new and unfamiliar foods, and they're offering it to you in a little cup and say, try this, it's a new product. That's what people do with molasses a lot of times. You spray on something that animals are familiar with. That's assuming your animals know molasses and like it. And you can use that to entice animals to sample unfamiliar foods. The first work I know of that we were ever involved with was at Deseret Land and Livestock, and that's getting cattle to eat thistles along the roadway. And it worked very well. The animals acquired a preference for it, and they stuck with thistle even after the molasses was no longer applied. I had a person last winter, fall and winter, sending me notes and slides saying they'd done that with other plants as well. We did it with sagebrush, with rabbit brush. That's sorry, had a brain glitch there with rabbit brush, and some burdock and some other plants. People have used that as a way to attract animals to utilize those plants. And that's all based on this idea of novel, familiar, dichotomy, and getting animals to sample things. There's the longer term kind of effects that start in utero, where mother is playing the key role. And for instance, with saltbrush in Australia, our friends and colleagues there showed that lambs exposed to saltbrush in utero grow faster and handle a salt load better than lambs from mothers on pastures. They excrete salt more rapidly, they drink less water, and maintain higher intake when eating saltbrush. So this is a transgenerational linkage that's very important. And getting these to be a part of your herd, these kind of behaviors to be a part of your herd, it becomes a very important objective. We showed that same sort of thing. We worked a lot with producers that were interested in trying to cut the costs of ranch operation by getting their animals to eat poor quality forages, basically during the winter time, mature, dried grasses, forbs, shrubs, and so forth. And we were showing that calves exposed, in this case, we ran studies with straw, but we can say that's a poor quality forage in utero. They eat more straw, they digest straw better, and they grow faster than calves not exposed to straw. We did another study where we had mature cows. They were 5 years old when we started this study. They'd been fed straw as calves 5 years before the study began. And then as throughout all 3 years of the study, compared to animals naive to straw, they digested straw better, they had better body weight and condition, they produced more milk, and they had shorter postpartum intervals when they were fed straw as the bulk of the diet during pregnancies from 5 to 8 years of age. So again, the power of these experiences early in life to not only get animals to change their foraging behavior, but to enable animals to utilize foods that you would think they might not be able to utilize so well. Many years ago, I did studies with young goats, either reared by their mothers on blackbrush, which is a shrub that's high in fiber and tannins. It's got secondary compounds. It's not a great shrub. And we compared their intake of blackbrush to animals that had been reared on better quality kinds of foods. And the goats with experience ate 2.5 times more blackbrush than did goats naive to blackbrush. And here's what becomes really important as part of getting your animals to utilize all the plants, is that when we gave them a choice, experienced goats ate 30% more blackbrush, meal in, meal out, than did inexperienced goats. At any level, we were offering alfalfa pellets at any level of alfalfa pellet availability, which ranged from 20% to 100% of ad libitum. So the goats had learned to incorporate blackbrush into their diet. There were some changes that took place in terms of organ systems in their body, including the rumen, that better enabled them to utilize blackbrush. I want to say a word here too, not only about goats, but you see I have cattle in the slide here. And cattle down in that part of the country winter on blackbrush. The ranchers there have selected for smaller frame size, but the cows all have calves, and it's amazing. Talk about animals learning how to utilize a food that you wouldn't think they would utilize. You watch those cows put their head down and just mow blackbrush. We did studies down there of cattle too, and it's just absolutely impressive. And it lets you know the ability and the flexibility of animals to incorporate things into their diet as a function of experience. Couple more examples on experience. In Israel, our friends and colleagues did studies of Damascus and Mambar goats. Damascus goats eat high tannin browse. There's some species there that really can take over the landscapes, and these Damascus goats eat them. So they're prized for that. The Mambar goats don't eat high tannin browse though. And one might think, well, this is something that's genetic. It's built into the animals. But when they did cross-fostering studies where they took baby kids from Damascus ewes and grafted them onto Mambar ewes at birth and vice versa, and then let the mothers raise them, and then looked at what the offspring did, they showed that the preferences of the kids for the high tannin browse were strongly reflected the preferences of their foster mothers. In other words, this was a learned behavior, and what mother did was hugely influencing what their offspring did. A key point I alluded to that I want to hit here is that these experiences early in life influence gene expression, which influences form, function, and behavior. And so when people look, and when we were doing these studies, we can find enhanced neural response to the plants, familiar olfactory cues, enhanced kidney function, altered rumen development, and so on and so forth. In other words, learning involves changes in form, function, and behavior of these animals. So to sum up this first part, I conclude like Larson did in this far side, after 40 years, 50 years of study, it's my contention couch potatoes actually begin to develop early in life as tater tots. And so, there's a nice literature on all kinds of species related to this, from otters to cetaceans, some marvelous kind of research showing the importance of mother and these social influences. Polar bears, tigers in India, lions in Africa, elephants, just amazing research showing they live in extended families, the role of matriarchs and knowledgeable matriarchs in terms of versus less knowledgeable matriarchs in terms of the offspring. Giraffes in Africa, of course, the primates, a lot of work on that. Raccoons and kittens, I don't know if so much work on that, but put it in for the sake of keeping this light. And then somewhere near Walmart, and we could speak a lot, and I get asked to speak a lot about this in talks about how we've lost those linkages to landscapes and the adverse effect it's having to us. But that's another story. So back to the rabbits then to finish up. As I mentioned, the diets of these rabbits are a result of social transmission of food preferences. But I said the rabbits are born in winter and spring. Milkweed doesn't grow until May. Now, one of the thoughts relative to what these researchers showed is that offspring of mothers who eat milkweed still show a preference for milkweed relative to naive ones. And what they're hypothesizing is that compounds in mother's diet, these secondary compounds or phytochemicals, as I'll call them, get stored in her fat. And during pregnancy, as she's metabolizing fat and using that, those compounds get released and they end up in the amniotic fluid. They provide flavor cues, which are giving those offspring an early experience with milkweed eaten the previous season. Some really fascinating kind of work. We're doing a huge amount of work nowadays, and this question came up, one of the questions: how does eating these plants influence the flavor of meat and milk? And I put in a slide and took it out because it's beyond what I want to get into, but I would simply want to say that we're doing a tremendous amount of work now. Stefan van Vliet at Utah State is the lead guy on this, looking at how experience with diverse arrays of foods is influencing the phytochemical and biochemical richness of meat and dairy, and the implications of that for health, not only in livestock, but in human beings as well. That's another topic. We'll leave that for another time, but I couldn't resist putting in a word here related to that. Okay, Larissa, so that's a start for us there on these transgenerational social cultural linkages. We'll build on that one, but are there burning questions that people have that we could touch on now?
I have not seen any come into the Q&A. So folks, we can pause for just a moment if you're thinking of one, and then we can continue to move on. And I'm sure circle back around because everything is connected. And just a note that we are recording this. So the recording will be available later today or tomorrow, along with the slides. So if you want to reference those in the future, you will have access to that. And I don't see anything that's come in, Fred. So maybe we can keep going.
Okay, let's keep rolling. If you do have questions, don't be shy to put those in. We'll keep building though on all this as we go and linking as we go as well. So
actually, let me should say that, and I spoke a little too soon, but there are a couple about toxicity. Let's see. One is are any of the plants referenced have a toxicity at some point in their growth? And then someone else asked, what are signs of developing toxicity. So, and I don't know if that's something you get to later.
Those are both very good questions. And I want to make a point of that as we go along and reiterate that point. One of the first things to do, I think, is to look at whether or not the plants that are growing in your place are potentially toxic to animals. I have a huge reference manual that I turn to. I don't know every plant everywhere, obviously, for certain. And so when people ask me, that's the first thing I'll do is go to that reference manual and look up what they write about that. And then I use that, share that with folks, and we use that as a building block. I'm going to talk about toxicity, and I'm going to talk about, build on that idea that I mentioned, that, whether or not a plant's toxic depends on many factors, not only where the plant's growing in the environment and how much of a toxin it produces. It depends on other plant species that are associated with that species, and we're going to get into that. We're going to get directly into those kind of questions. But I think it's so important to address that question up front with plant species. For instance, when people sent me notes on asking, or sent Larissa notes asking about poison ivy, bindweed, Canada thistle, burdock, some of those I knew and knew could be eaten. There were some other ones that I didn't know about. Woolly croton, yellow crownbeard, the parsnips, the wild parsnips, that's a family that can have some very nutritious plants. It can also have deadly toxic plants in it for humans and livestock. So that definitely is a starting point in any kind of thoughts about using what we consider unpalatable or weedy species. And I'm going to build on that as we go, but just a few words right there.
I know it's hard to resist. And then in terms of there's a follow-up, just a quick follow-up question, is the reference manual that you were talking about, is that something that's available? Is that yours, or is it something that's publicly?
Yes, that's something that's available. If you have a lot of money, it's available to you. Anyway, Toxic Plants of North America is the title of it. And I've just found it hugely invaluable. I just go through every kind of species you can imagine, and not just the ones that you would think of as classically poisonous plants, but weedy species of all sorts. And so that's the title, and I can share that full citation with you, Larissa. But I'm also happy, and I've done it a lot for people. They'll send me the name of their plant, and it's important to know the scientific name, so we're dealing with the same thing. And then I'll look up information and scan it and send it to people, and it's a great place to start.
Awesome. Okay. Well, there's one kind of more, there's a couple more questions that came in. I think we can probably save them for later, but someone, I'll just read this out loud, and they say, so to get the offspring to eat unpalatable foods, get their mothers to eat them, as kind of a summarization. Is that kind of what you
Yes,
say?
and it's a little bit of a catch-22, as I was saying, in that, so how do you get the mothers to eat them? That's exactly right. Getting the mothers to eat them is a key, and then then you're home free, assuming that they're not going to be poisoned. Mom's going to be a good model. The mom's the best teacher out there. She's, that, as you saw in that video, what she does really influences what they do. So then it's a question of how you get mom to do that. And as we say, so the old dogs can learn new tricks. Some people have used things like molasses. We'll talk more about how to get moms to do that too. We're not going to just leave it at that. But I thought it was really interesting in that one study where the young animals taught the mothers, actually. And that wasn't a study, it was a real life deal. And it wasn't what they wanted, actually. But the offspring taught the moms to eat the plant, and then mom after that was teaching the offspring. So, it's just, all this to me is fascinating to realize what's happening, and then to think about, to put in the brain about how you might go about getting these things to become a part of the culture of your herd. That's why I started there. And now we'll, in these next two sections, we'll get in, well, how can you get moms to do some of these things? How can we get some of these behaviors going, in addition to something like spraying molasses on? which in a way is a bit of a silver bullet, but in another way, it's you know, it's not. It's breaking over that neophobia, that cautious sampling of unfamiliar, something that's unfamiliar, that animals do that so predictively and so amazingly. It's how you get that to change. And spraying molasses is one way we talked about the young animals learning. Also, too, you know, I've had several notes from ranchers over the years talking about how to do this and talking about, well, my neighbor's animals eat this plant, mine don't. And, you know, the key thing there is try to get some of your neighbor's animals over with your animals and let them teach them. That social influence is huge.
On that note, we can check back in on the questions. There are some more that came in, but we can see if they get answered along the way. Otherwise, we will answer them later.
Okay, Larissa, let's for sure do that. I don't want to ignore any questions. Let's keep going. And then if we don't hit on them, let's come back to them for certain. Don't want to ignore anyone in any of this. So the second part then, you know, so we say these young animals sample foods cautiously, and then they increase or decrease intake depending upon the consequences. Well, those consequences depend on these flavor feedback relationships. So let's talk about that a little bit. And if I were to ask you why you like a particular food, you tell me because it tastes good. Why don't you like a particular food? Odds are you tell me because it tastes bad. And that's certainly the case. Liking for food is very strongly influenced by taste, but it's also influenced by feedback from cells and organ systems. And that feedback is coming in response to these primary compounds that would be energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, and so forth. And this vast array of secondary compounds or phytochemicals, the tens of thousands of these compounds that plants produce, and that can be either nutritious or they can be toxic, as we've been saying. So palatability then is more than a matter of taste. And I want to show you, you know, we did so many studies of this over a 30-year period, looking at what increases preference, what decreases preference, and all driven by feedback. So I'm going to show you a short video of two groups of sheep. One group, after they ate the meal, we had given them a post-ingestive consequence that caused them to want to eat more of that food. We'd given them a nutrient that they were lacking. We did that simply by what's referred to as oral gavage, stick a stomach tube in right into the stomach, drench them with the nutrient they're lacking in this case here. The other group simply received the carrier water. They didn't get the nutrient, and it makes a huge difference. Now, I'm illustrating this with nutrients, but we did the same thing with toxins. You know, in that little video of moms eating one food and avoiding the other food, we trained that with feedback from lithium chloride, as Kathy was saying. So feedback is playing a huge role, and this is how it looks when we do those things. So one group absolutely loves straw, the other group can't figure out what's going on, and it's all being mediated by feedback. Their change in liking for the food is being mediated by feedback from nutrients in this case here. So there wasn't a case we looked at where that didn't play a huge role. We started out working with energy, and then we looked at energy in a variety of different forms, from whole plants like straw to cellulose, starch, glucose, volatile fatty acids. We looked at protein in various forms. We looked at protein to energy ratios. we looked at minerals, and colleagues in Australia looked at vitamins. And in every case, when animals have a need, that condition these compounds infused into the gut condition strong preferences. Now, the secondary compounds, historically, they were viewed by agronomists as toxins, and they were viewed by ecologists who were studying wild animals foraging on plants as feeding deterrents. But what's become clear is that for both primary and secondary compounds, everything depends on the dose. Everything depends on the dose. At lower concentrations, these phenolics, alkaloids, terpenes, and so forth can actually have nutritious, health-promoting kind of effects on animals. They can serve as antioxidants, as anti-inflammatory compounds. They can also serve as medicines to reduce, for instance, internal parasites in animals. So what happens then is that liking for food, as everything in life, depends upon complex interactions between primary and secondary compounds. And the body, which is a miracle, is integrating all of these from tens of thousands of compounds, is integrating this information. And then animals are simply selecting what tastes good and avoiding what tastes bad. So let's build on this idea of these interactions between primary and secondary compounds as part of the story. And I'll go back to where I started, that these plants are incredibly dynamic. Some species are nutritious, others are toxic. Individual plants can be nutritious or toxic depending upon the time of day, the week, and the season, and on the resources available in the environment. There were questions on timing of grazing and also timing of cutting hay. And let me just say a word about that. The one question is, when's the best time to clip for dairy production grazing? Well, in fact, what we're talking about absolutely relates. In the morning, plants tend to be lower in soluble carbohydrates than they are in the afternoon. And when you give animals a choice of AM versus PM harvested hay, for instance, they prefer the afternoon harvested hay because it's higher in energy. So that was a good question related to timing. Now think about, it's not only energy, but it's protein, it's these secondary compounds. All these things are varying throughout the day. I had another interesting question related to timing. Why do I not see hemp, dogbane, or milkweed in my pastures, but I see it in my hay fields that are grazed late in the season? And I'm thinking that probably is very importantly related to the timing of cutting of hay fields and grazing and so forth. Time and timing, as I'm going to talk here in a minute, become very important. So a person can be thinking about in terms of not only how do I get animals to eat foods that they might be avoiding, but also how through time of grazing can I reduce the abundance of some plants that I'd like to not have so much of, basically. And that takes me to the food for thought, an example that I want to develop along those lines. And I mentioned Kathy Both earlier. She worked on our project for a 10-year period, did fabulous work on outreach, and got very interested in training animals to eat weeds. And I recommend checking out all her materials on encouraging animals to eat weeds. But back in those early days, people were saying, well, you're just trying to force animals, starve the animals so that they'll eat the plants that you want them to eat, these weedy species. So it raises a question, is it better to make animals hungry so they'll eat plants, or should you have them in a really good nutritional state? Which is most important? Now, we worked a lot with livestock producers in many states, as I'll show you, about on these kind of issues. And I think of Aldo Leopold in Sant County Almanac, where he pointed out the axe, the cow, and the plow and people. The axe, the cow, and the plow have degraded landscapes, but they can also be used to build them back up. And in our case here, we were really interested in how the sheep and the cows could be used to do that. And so we were looking at rejuvenating sagebrush steppe landscapes in many states. It's a project built. We had people working, and this is livestock producers in Oregon, Montana, Nevada, Wyoming, and Utah. And I'll feature the work we did in those states here as I go along. But, you know, for many reasons, fossil fuels with machinery and what that does to landscapes. I mean, in the 50s, that was something that happened a lot. You chaining as ways to get rid of plants that people didn't want. It's extremely costly nowadays. Herbicides, people aren't so interested in putting more toxins on landscapes nowadays for obvious reasons. So why not use animals? Why not? And not only sheep and cattle, but we were working with elk as well, kind of like the people working with the rabbits in the Netherlands. Can we get animals to utilize plants that they might not ordinarily utilize? How can we do that? What's happened in the Great Basin across all those states is that historically spring grazing, people grazed sagebrush steppe landscapes during the spring of the year, and grazing at that time of the year favors sagebrush over grasses and forbs. Sheep and cattle both strongly prefer the grasses and forbs to sagebrush during the spring, summer, and early fall, actually. And so that leads then to strong domination by sagebrush. And that led to a lot of manipulations, of mechanical and chemical manipulations to try to reduce the abundance of sagebrush. And sagebrush came to be seen as really a plant species nobody liked or wanted. So what happens over time then is you get an increase in sage and a decrease in grasses and forbs. You end up with less plant and animal diversity, which isn't necessarily good for wild or domestic animals. You know, you get a decrease in primary compounds across the landscape, increase in lignin and terpenoids, and that's also affecting rates of nutrient cycling and decomposition, soil health as well. So what we did was to think about, and we had friends that we knew, some at the Poisonous Plants Lab that said, well, you know, sagebrush really, by all rights, in a way, it's a poisonous plant. It's a toxic plant. It's so high in terpenes that it adversely affects everything from the rumen microbiome to the ruminants themselves and so forth. And it's true. But what we thought about is, and did work on, is do concentrations of terpenes change seasonally in sagebrush? And we showed with feeding studies where we would offer sagebrush at different times of the year, and then working with natural products chemists who could analyze levels of terpenes, we showed that fall and winter, late fall and winter, terpene concentrations really drop in sagebrush. And so that's a great time to be grazing sagebrush. And we knew actually that deer and elk would utilize sagebrush up to 30% of their diet during the winter. And so it's a good time to try to graze sagebrush. Grasses and forbs are dormant at that time. So we aren't going to put pressure on them. We're going to put the pressure on sagebrush, try to release, encourage the grasses and forbs to grow. And it's also a good time for ranchers. If you switch your mindset from sagebrush is the devil to sagebrush could be a winter forage and help to reduce feeding costs during the winter. So that's the approach that we took. We were working with ranchers in all these places. And we knew that sagebrush limits intake of a palatable ration if you add sagebrush to a nutritious forage. In other words, sagebrush is setting a limit on intake. And terpenes in sagebrush are what are setting that limit, basically, that are causing animals to eat a limited amount so that they don't poison themselves, basically. But what we also were doing and learning about is that the worst thing you can do if you want animals to eat some unpalatable plants like sagebrush, and I would say that probably more generally, and I'll go back to, I'm jumping around on you a bit here, I'll go back to spraying molasses on thistle. You know, thistle is high in nitrates, and it could be toxic if it was eaten enough, if animals ate enough. But the energy in molasses actually helps with detoxification processes. So it's a good spraying molasses on thistle has a double whammy of providing a nutrient boost that animals need and helping encouraging them to sample something they haven't eaten before. And what we were showing in many, many studies is that supplemental energy and protein enhance intake of foods like sagebrush. And they do that by, to get rid of sagebrush from the body requires nutrients. Nutrients enhance detoxification and elimination of secondary compounds by animals. And so here's examples with sheep and goats. We showed the same thing with cattle. Supplemental protein and energy can nearly double intake of sagebrush by animals. So we went to the field. We did the first work at Deseret Land and Livestock with sheep producers who were running sheep over there at Deseret at that time. And in 2001, we had low stock densities, and we provided no supplement at all for the control animals. And it was very interesting to see. We had to end that trial quite early. We only ran it about 2 weeks. And the animals that were receiving the supplement would go out and they just mow sagebrush. They were eating a lot of sagebrush each day. The animals that received no supplement, after about a week, I don't remember exactly now, but probably a week or so, they'd go out and they just stand. They could not utilize sagebrush. So we just said we've got to end this trial. But it's showing how critically important supplemental nutrients are on enabling animals to utilize a very unpalatable plant. In 2003, what we did was we had high stock densities. Again, we supplemented the animals, one set of animals, and in no time they had utilized all of the sagebrush. So how did that look and what goes on? This may not look like anything extraordinary to you. If you look in the background of some of these pictures, you'll see the monoculture of sage. Over the years that we ran this trial, we were able to, sagebrush doesn't tolerate grazing well. So if you get heavy use on it, you reduce its abundance. And we were able to show marked increases in grasses and forbs relative to sagebrush. We still had a bit of sagebrush in the stands, which we wanted. We didn't want to totally eliminate it. We simply wanted to decrease its abundance. And we were able to do that. I remember one field trip we were on with ranchers and wildlife people and range people and just diverse array of different groups. And we came to these plots, and the first thing people said, and it was fun and kind of funny, they said, "So what herbicide did you use on these plots?" I said, "No herbicide at all. We used sheep on these plots," which is surprising. A lot of the wildlife folks actually have fallen into this kind of a trap that livestock can only be bad for landscapes. They can't do good things. And I know it's not everybody, but we saw that often. And they fall back on herbicides to do these sort of things when livestock can be very valuable, and it can improve production not only of livestock, but wildlife species as well. And so we were showing at a landscape level with bands of sheep that we could use sheep to rejuvenate sage-grouse habitat. And in this picture where it says Michael Guthrie's PhD thesis, you can see some mosaics, some patches. This was our attempt across this enormous landscape to create patchiness. And then Michael Guthrie was looking at the degree to which sage-grouse were utilizing those patches, and it markedly increased that. So our idea was then in this broader project to integrate livestock into the system, not see them simply as some treatment that you apply, with the idea of improving habitat, creating diversity for a wide range of different species, create mosaics of habitat to meet the needs of these different species. And within a species, say they're within and among species, different species, sage-grouse have different needs at different times of the year. So while a dense stand of sagebrush might be beneficial at some times of the year. It might not be beneficial at all. For instance, nesting and brood-rearing habitat where they want grasses, forbs, and some insect species. There you want some diversity in the environment. Finally, on this one, we did the same kind of work with cattle. We worked with A.G. Smith at Cottonwood Ranch and showed the very same kind of interrelationships that we're talking about here. We did, in some cases, utilize molasses to get the old cows to start to sample sagebrush. We supplemented them with hay to put them in a good nutritional state so that they could utilize sagebrush, and did that during the winter period. Matt Carter runs Crown Cattle Company in Oregon, and he went down this path with his cattle, and we had him give a talk at one of the Behave meetings. It was a fabulous presentation. I really had to twist his arm. He wasn't used to public speaking, but he did a wonderful job of talking about the changes that he made, and how he'd spent so much money trying to get rid of sagebrush, never saw it as something that might be valuable, or thought about how through time and timing and all these things we're talking about, he may have been able to make that into a resource. And think about over time, if at first you're supplementing cattle with hay and you're getting them to use sagebrush as a result of that, over the years, you're reducing the abundance of sagebrush and increasing the abundance of grasses and forbs that would be dormant during that time. Sagebrush is a great source of protein for animals. So you have protein in the shrub, you have dormant grasses and shrubs. You're moving your system towards something that's long-term sustainable, and you're getting out of winter feeding and the fossil fuel loops. So let me say a couple of words that build on this related to self-medicating and give you a food for thought. You know, there's huge emphasis now on soil and soil health, and for good reason. I often like to say that plants are what turns dirt into soil, and that rich mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for creatures above and below ground. And there's linkages there related to phytochemicals. And a question I would have you raise for you is, how can diets rich in phytochemicals enable herbivores to eat unpalatable plants? How can that happen? Well, there's two ways that animals can self-medicate. One is therapeutically, after they've had a hard night on the town, like this little guy here, or after they've eaten something that's not good for them. As we've shown, they can self-medicate under those conditions, or internal parasites, and on and on and on. Well, here's a list of things. And we know that when they have access to diverse mixtures of plants, everything from insects to primates can self-medicate using phytochemicals. We showed that livestock learn to self-medicate when they're on high-grain diets to relieve acidosis, when they're on plants like alfalfa that cause bloat, they can learn to self-medicate to alleviate that. Same with toxins and parasites and so forth. Here's an interesting thing, though, to think about, and I think we don't often think about that if we're providing supplements, or even in this case here, worming with ivermectin. It can change food selection of animals. Goats and sheep, for instance, are more inclined to self-medicate when they aren't provided with antiparasitic drugs. Parasitized sheep eat less high tannin food, so the tannins are enabling animals to self-medicate. Terpenes in plants like sagebrush also do that. Combinations of tannin terpene foods like bitterbrush and sagebrush work even better. They can help animals to alleviate internal parasite loads, and they'll back off of high tannin food when their parasite infection is terminated with drug like ivermectin. The other way that animals can self-medicate is prophylactically or preventatively. And, you know, historically, the people like me and others that from when they were young were watching what animals eat, you know, and recording that, we knew that 3 to 5 plants make up the bulk of the diet, but animals will often sample 50 to 75 plants in a meal, depending upon all these experiential things we're talking about. And we know that health is enhanced when livestock graze phytochemically rich mixtures of grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees. So I was saying, these plants turn turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for creatures below ground and above ground too. We know also that each species of plant harbors a unique rhizosphere community, the bacteria, the fungi, the kind of plants that can live and survive on the combination of primary and secondary compounds that each plant produces. And when you have diverse arrays of plants, you enhance the soil microbiome in ways that can enhance nutrient availability and alter plant chemistry. This becomes very, very, very important. I mentioned that the same species of plants growing in different environmental conditions changes chemically. And that has really important implications for longer term getting animals to utilize plants that they might not utilize. Diversity matters in important ways in all of this. Here's some studies from the tallgrass prairie, where they were showing that after 23 years, plots with 16 perennial plant species had from 150 to 370% higher levels of nutrients relative to monocultures of the plant growing together. So it's really relating back to these interactions that go on when you get diversity. They also have 30 to 90% more water and nutrient holding carbon in the soil. So I often think that nothing's more important for health through nutrition for animals than a diversity of different plant species. There's really good studies going on in the US, in New Zealand, where they're showing that health improves when livestock graze diverse mixtures of plants compared with monocultures. They gain weight more efficiently with less emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, and they can reach slaughter weight nearly as quickly as animals in feedlots. So a lot of good work going on related to plant diversity. And then this whole idea of diversity, the diversity of plant species, the diversity of bacteria and fungi in the soil, that influences the diversity of species in the microbiome of the rumen. And that can influence strongly the ability of animals to utilize plants that they might not ordinarily use. I've got sheep there showing them eating halogeton. And when sheep there are bacteria in the rumen, if it's in the soil and gets into the gut of the animals, there are bacteria that break down oxalates. Oxalates are the compounds that cause toxicity in halogeton. And so the microbiome is enabling sheep, in this case, to eat a plant that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to eat because bacteria in the gut can break down the oxalates. Also, forcing animals, going back to that idea of forcing animals to utilize too much of a plant, that happened with halogeton years ago. They trucked hungry sheep for many miles, put them on a landscape they'd never been in before. Halogeton was the main plant species where they dumped them off. The sheep over-ingested the halogeton and literally hundreds and hundreds of animals died. If they'd been allowed to gradually, remember food neophobia, gradually increase intake of that plant, they wouldn't have had any problems whatsoever, because over 10 days to 2 weeks, bacteria in the gut that degrade oxalates, their populations increase because they've got a substrate now that they can utilize. There wouldn't have been any problems. So thinking about that is another part of this equation. And I know there's a lot of work going nowadays. Elaine Ingram talks about increasing the diversity of plants and the soil health and the soil microbiome. All these microbiomes get linked. Same sort of story for mimosa in Australia. And I'll save the story because it's the same thing. When cattle had in their guts microbes that degrade mimosine, which is a toxic compound in mimosa, they could eat it really readily. If they didn't, they wouldn't utilize it because it was toxic to them. Okay, Larissa, more questions. We're going to continue to build on where we've been up to this point, but that's, we've got one more section. Are there other questions, more questions?
Yeah, there's been a couple that have come in. Let me ask this. So a couple of them came in from the last section, but I think are fine to ask now. Someone's asking, what is the typical training time before the young animals, quote unquote, get it? How long does that take for them to kind of learn the ropes?
That slide that I showed on food neophobia, and you'll have access to that as Larissa posts this, that's not bad. We would find, over a few days to a week to 2 weeks, they'll gradually come on. That's what we saw. They don't. Now, I'm trying to make a generalization. Of course, generalizations never work. But in our experience, if animals are eating a otherwise nutritious diet, they have what they want, and you start to get them interested in another plant, we've never seen them just immediately eat a ton of that plant, unless they were really, really deficient in something and it worked. Then that can happen quickly. But it'll be over several days to a week to a couple of weeks, 10 days. And, over and over again in the ruminant nutrition literature, when people were looking at the microbiomes of animals and their ability to adapt, they would typically say 10 days to 2 weeks is what it takes for bacteria in the gut for their populations to build up. So it's kind of a nice sinkage between what the animals are doing with their cautious sampling and enabling their system to adapt, at least in the short term, with the microbiome. Going back again, and not to sound like a broken record, but these experiences, then, if mothers doing that start in the womb and early in life and all that, are really enabling gene expression and whole organ systems to adapt, in addition to the microbiome.
So interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and so interconnected, as you're saying, and that's where hopefully, hopefully this is making some sense and not yeah, it is so connected, all of it, I think, and trying to think in multiple dimensions about how to approach something like a plant that animals won't eat gives a lot of ways to approach that.
Yeah, definitely. So question, someone said that they purchased some electric fencing and they have a lot of yellow crown beard or stickweed. Would you recommend I do a big circle in the field with stickweed and just keep my sheep in it there for a week?
I don't know a lot about yellow crown beard, but I was reading because that was a question that was here. So let me preface with that. I read that the plant is very toxic, but rarely eaten by livestock because of its high toxicity. Sheep are most sensitive, followed by cattle and pigs. I'm reading you. Most field cases occur during periods of drought when little other feed is available. Now, two things there with the drought. Drought can increase concentrations of some of these nasty metabolites. And I'm happy to follow up with you, whoever's asking that and wrote this, with us really getting into more detail. So you have drought can increase concentrations. If they don't have other species, what's that doing? The nutrients that could come from those other species and help with detoxification processes aren't there. So it becomes a double whammy that can be there. They say high levels of nitrate in mature plants and so forth, mainly mature plants that are eaten. Older plants appear to be more toxic than young ones and so forth. So, many of the topics that we're raising come to bear on that plant. And I'm happy to follow up with you on working our way through some of that. But I think I would be, and I haven't worked with the plant. So, but given that it is potentially quite toxic, I think a person needs to be careful of how they do it and not overwhelm the animals. Another thing, and I'm jumping around, but when you get grazing management involved and you start to bring animals into the equation and you get them, you're pooping and peeing on those landscapes, getting natural organic kind of inputs back into the system, that's going to change the chemistry of plants. Now, it depends on what compounds the plant has. Sometimes the compounds will go up, other times they'll go down. So those are other things to consider. And again, I'm going to go back and say on specific plants, if you want to contact me and we can work our way through some of what to anticipate on different things and ways to approach it, I'm happy to do that. So hopefully that's not too bad of a non-answer to that question, but those are the things that when we were thinking about sagebrush, those are things we were talking about, thinking about, and your question's a very good one. And then thinking about, well, how do we proceed here? People were saying, you're going to poison the animals on sagebrush, and we're saying, well, not necessarily if we're cautious of this and that and the next thing and so forth. So.
Awesome. Okay, let me get through a couple more questions. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I think we'll probably go over by a little bit, Fred, our 90 minutes, since I know you still have another section to do. But someone's asking, do you notice a stepwise selection of plants like they have seen in goats in Europe? For example, a high protein is then followed by a low protein plant in sequential feeding sessions.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to get into some of that a bit in this next section. But
Perfect.
Yes, we do, because animals satiate on these different compounds. And so if you've got, for instance, if you feed a high protein supplement, everything's a toxin, basically, as Paracelsus said hundreds of years ago. Everything's toxic. The dose differentiates. So if they've got enough protein already in their system, they're going to avoid other protein. It's exactly where we're going next. That's a perfect setup for this last section. A great question.
Awesome. Well, let me just keep that one in mind. Someone's asking, so this is kind of a two-part question. Someone's saying that they're getting conflicted information about spotted knapweed. And NRCS told me it's toxic, but I've seen references to cattle eating it and my sheep eat it at certain points of the season. On the opposite end, I have a couple of ewes who I believe are eating yarrow and bloating. One called herself, but can you train them to stop eating something toxic? And why might some animals eat toxic plants and others don't?
Yeah,
so there's a lot going on.
That's a really, really good, many part question. Where to start? Certainly sheep can utilize knapweed. A lot of nice research to show that. Cattle can eat it in some amounts as well. Why do animals eat something that poisons them? That's a really I have whole presentations on that, actually, of how that happens, that animals get tricked into eating something that can poison them. I think I'll leave it at that for right now. Too many thoughts are coming to mind. And I'll be happy to follow up with you on that question. That's a rich question. So many things that we could discuss related to that one.
Definitely. Okay. Someone's asking, why should you not feed goats first cutting hay?
Oh, good question. I don't know. I would guess that the issues would be related to bloat. And that would again be related to how much you offer them. If you offer them a small amount, you're probably not likely to have too much problems with that. That's what comes to my mind. Also, I mentioned that animals can self-medicate for bloat. If there's tannin-containing plants that are around in an environment, and we could get into, there are many species that contain tannins, but tannins bind with the compounds that cause bloat in animals. So that's a way that animals can learn to self-medicate and reduce incidence of bloat, assuming that's why that's what I've heard related to alfalfa many times, is issues related to bloat.
Gotcha. Okay, and the last question for right now is someone's wondering if you could speak a little bit more about why you would spray molasses.
The idea behind the molasses, and this goes back to familiarity as well, is that many animals become familiar with molasses as a result of being supplemented with foods that have molasses, say during the dormant season or the winter period. And so it's a familiar substance. It's sweet. Animals really like molasses a lot. And so it's simply an attractant that can be sprayed on a plant to encourage animals to start to sample something that they wouldn't ordinarily eat.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that's all we have right now, Fred. So I think we can.
Okay, listen, let's do this last one. I'll try to go. I want to say quickly, but not too quickly. So building on these first two, let's talk about this idea of satiety and variety. And the question that was asked at the last break was really good related to that. And I give you a food for thought here. You know, Sericea lespedeza is a weedy species in Kansas, Missouri, several states in that region. People don't like it. It increases in abundance. And so people think about what we're talking about. How can we get cattle to utilize Sericea? Tall fescue, endophyte infected tall fescue especially, by all rights, is a toxic plant. And so there was a producer that I met years ago that said, I put 4 daughters through college on a mix of Sericea lespedeza and endophyte infected tall fescue. The question is, why do cattle perform so well on what many people would consider the mix of plants from hell? And let's start into this by simply talking about satiation, the question that was raised, if animals are getting protein in one place or one form, then do they eat low protein later on? Let's address some of those and step back and say that, like us, eating any food to satiety causes transient food aversions in livestock as well, based on interactions among flavor, primary and secondary compounds. You know, looking at all these different foods here, they're all hamburger based in this particular case here. And I put that to make a point. If you had to eat hamburger in the same form day after day after day, and it was the only thing you were being fed, it wouldn't be long until you're saying, I'm sick and tired of eating hamburger. So what do? We change the flavors. We offer it in a variety of different ways, and that keeps us interested in eating it. And from a feedback standpoint, it's altering primary and secondary compounds and the feedback that's coming. So, you know, we talk about the grass is always greener on the other side, and there's certainly a truth to that, and especially with monocultures. So it's these interactions. Let's briefly say a word about each of these kind of how flavor, primary and secondary compounds interact to influence satiety and cause us to eat, us and livestock, a variety of foods, and then talk about the implications. So from a flavor specific standpoint, we showed with cattle and sheep both, and this is when we were working with straw and looking at intake of ammoniated straw. If you offer animals maple flavor, and this is just for one day, offer a maple flavored food for a day, all day long, and then give them a choice between coconut and maple flavored food. For the next several days, they want coconut, more coconut than maple, but look at how those lines are crossing over. Same thing with coconut. All that's saying is that even when the feedback is held constant, flavor, animals satiate on flavor. They like a variety of different flavors like we do. There's also a nutrient specific part that relates very much to the question. You know, we were showing that if you give a meal high in energy and then give animals a choice between food high in energy or high in protein, they prefer the high protein food. Vice versa, if you offer them a meal high in protein, they then prefer the high energy. And what they're doing is balancing ratios of energy to protein and not overdoing it on one or the other of those. And, you know, we did a lot of work with Daryl Emick and pasture-based dairying in New York and other parts of the country. And Daryl was showing, as part of his PhD thesis, that what's fed in the barn influences what dairy cows do on pasture. If we fed high levels of protein in the barn, that caused cattle to eat less clover and other high protein plants when they went out to pasture. So there's these relationships that people can work with, and I'm build on how you can do that. There's also the secondary compound specific satiety. And as we've been alluding to, if not saying, all plants contain secondary compounds and they limit intake. They set a limit on how much of any one plant an animal can eat. This is how that looks, though. It's not just a straight line. This is looking at intake of larkspur, which is very high in alkaloids out on western rangelands. And this is looking at an individual cow and her buddies who are all the same, different patterns. But you know, the animals cycle up and down on foods. They don't eat the same amount of food day in, day out. So that's the secondary compound specific satiety and how that looks in practice. Now, we did a bunch of studies with plants like alfalfa, bird's foot trefoil, endophyte infected tall fescue, where we were showing if prior to going out to graze, we gave animals a supplement of saponins, which alfalfa is high in saponins, then the animals would prefer to eat trefoil and endophyte infected tall fescue. They'd had enough. They'd satiated on the saponins that are in alfalfa. If we gave a supplement of alkaloids, she ate less fescue and more trefoil and alfalfa. And the same sort of thing with trefoil. If we gave a supplement of tannins, then they went for the alkaloids and went for the food for the alfalfa that's high in saponins, and for the fescue that's high in alkaloids. We'll come back to that here in just a minute, but hopefully you get the idea. They're satiating and they're regulating their intake of different foods as a function of that. So why do cattle perform so well on the mix of plants from hell? Sericea is high in tannins, and those tannins are forming complexes with the alkaloids in tall fescue when animals eat those two plants in combination. So you bind up the alkaloids, they're not being absorbed into the body. You're not having an adverse effect on the cattle. And so that's why, as that producer said, my cattle love that combination. I put 4 daughters through college on that combination of plants. So these interactions then, thinking about what plant species do I have, and that idea of on the yellow crown beard, for instance, you know, what if any other plants are available in the environment, and what if any other plants might interact with crownbeard in ways that would benefit animals? That's something that comes to my mind right off the bat. So this idea of complementarities of sequences, then food. Glenn Elzinga owns Alder Spring Ranch out here in Idaho. He's gotten quite well known for the amazing work that he's doing on landscapes and producing forage finished beef that's incredibly rich in phytochemicals and biochemicals that promote health. Well, what Glenn does for approximately half of the year when he's on rangelands is to move animals as the shepherds did in France. He's got into this book, The Art and Science of Shepherding, Tapping the Wisdom of French Herders, and thought, you know, this is something that we could do and really take advantage of. And I'm not in this sense saying that everybody should be shepherds, but it's the ideas of these complementarities and sequences that matter so much here. You know, these grazing circuits are what shepherds do. So when a shepherd looks at a landscape and he sees everything from first rate to disgusting, he or she is thinking about how do we set up sequences that enable animals to utilize plants that they might not ordinarily be able to utilize. And how can we do that in ways that allow us to utilize all of the resources in an environment. In other words, they can use this to target graze to enhance and maintain biodiversity, which is a very important part of why they got involved in this historically. They can stimulate appetite and intake of plants that they might not ordinarily use, and it enables individual animals. There's a comment at the last break about the animals. Some animals can utilize knapweed, leafy spurge. Some animals can utilize leafy spurge, other animals can't utilize it well at all. That individuality, it's the last words I'm going to say, is really important. And when you have a diversity of species, that enables individuals to regulate their intake of these primary and secondary compounds. Every individual is absolutely unique, just as we are. And so you can't make statements about the whole herd. You need to think about individuality, and biodiversity enables that. We were showing years ago that biochemically diverse diets enable sequences that complement one another. For instance, an appetizer of trefoil, which is high in tannins, helps animals to eat and to fight infected tall fescue, just as Sericea does. On rangelands, an appetizer of bitterbrush helps the sagebrush to go down. The tannins in bitterbrush are binding with terpenes in sagebrush and enabling animals to utilize way more sagebrush. And this goes for cattle and sheep both, and no doubt for goats as well. We did the studies with cattle and sheep. When animals gain experience mixing their diets with different plant species, they'll broaden their diets out. That's the only point that I want to make here. I could go into a lot of studies that we did. And, in experience and the availability of alternative foods, when we had inexperienced and experienced animals, and we offered them ad lib access to foods they were familiar with, as well as foods that this group wasn't familiar with, high in terpenes, oxalates, and tannins, the inexperienced animals just stuck with what was familiar to them. The experienced animals, even with ad lib access to other really desirable foods, ate a lot of the foods that had oxalates, tannins, and terpenes. When we restricted intake, the experienced animals just jumped right on board. The inexperienced animals ate much less of the foods, and they didn't even touch the foods with terpenes. So again, this idea of learning how to mix and match diets, it's probably sounding complicated, but moms can teach these sort of things. In this case here, the bitterbrush and sagebrush example, we were showing that under experimental conditions at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in DuBois, Idaho. They were selecting for groups of sheep that would eat sagebrush. And they did that by looking at feces of the sheep and simply keeping ones that ate large amounts of sagebrush. And they thought it was something physiological and morphological. The sheep had enhanced ability to utilize terpenes in sagebrush. And that certainly can happen and does happen. But what they came to find out is that the sheep that were eating so much sagebrush had learned to use bitterbrush as an appetizer to make the sagebrush go down. So very, very kind of interesting and revealing studies. When animals learn to mix their diets, they can eat way more forage than when they don't. That's the point of these species here, 1 or 2 versus all 3 species. Let me say just a few words about what herders do to get you thinking a little bit. They can teach naive animals about forages and herding conditions. Michelle Mireille and I wrote a paper about that, and I'm happy to share that with all of you about how you can use training in the field to get animals to do what we've been talking about. Teach herd to respect boundaries of grazing sectors, not so important for us here. Modulate temporary palatability scoring of various forages. That has to do exactly with what we're talking about. And then designing grazing circuits to create food synergies by meal sequencing. So herders try to avoid 2 situations. One is offering a highly desirable but rare forage right off the bat, because that can lead to frustration and reduced food intake. because the animals, this is trying to be illustrated here, all they're, quote, thinking about is this forage that they'd really like to eat. So herders avoid doing that. They avoid offering a limited array of forages because that can lead to wariness and lower daily intake. In other words, animals get sick and tired of eating the same old thing. So how do you keep varieties apart? To avoid frustration and wariness, herders make use of different vegetation patches. They do so predictably during the day, and the best foods are left for the dessert. So best for first course, acceptable, unacceptable for now. They're learning how to mix those. I'm going to come back to that. They're training the sheep how to do that. Herders end each circuit with highly appreciated forages. That prevents animals from searching for them during the day. The animals know they're going to get a big reward at the end of the day. Herders ration access to the best spots, such as river banks or tree fruits, during each grazing circuit to reinforce the herd's reliance on and trust of the herder. It's amazing. The herder is really a member of the flock. I often think of the herder as the, quote, matriarch. The animals follow them and do what they need to do. I'm probably not doing any justice at all to the nuance that goes into what the herders have learned. And the herders are actually trying things with the animals. They're experimenting all the time, and they're learning from the animals. It's a two-way street that's really so impressive in terms of what that ultimately enables people to do. So they move the animals in these meal phases that start with appetite moderator, then appetite stimulators, first course on a target area, then a booster stage, second course on a target area, dessert course to end the day, and so forth. And it may sound a little bit crazy to us, but it's not. It reflects their deep understanding of plant species and habitat types and how to utilize those. And so I think even though we may not think of ourselves as wanting to be herders, it's that kind of knowledge that enables them to utilize all these species that they might ordinarily see as disgusting, and if you insist. Stockmanship can be used. It's important as part of moving and placing animals to utilize different habitats. We did a lot of work. John and Jocelyn Haskell did a lot of work during the Behave program on just that idea. And I think, Larissa, for the sake of everyone's time, I'm not going to tell the stories. You get the idea of that. In Australia, they've done the same thing. I spent a lot of time there doing workshops and talking about these things, and they've done some really neat work on that. I don't think this is too long of a video, but let me show this and then we'll wind it up. Of using stockmanship to train sheep, to move sheep and train them to utilize
Welcome
thistle in
to
this case.
Weed Eating with Stress-Free Stockmanship. This is the first lesson that these 2-year-old ewes have had with these new methods. Have a look at what they're eating now, and then we'll soon see what they're eating in their second lesson. This is the second lesson, just 15 minutes later with that same group of animals in the same area. And have a look at what they're eating now. Isn't it spectacular how they're actually concentrating on the weeds? You can tell they've got plenty of other material there to eat, lots and lots of lush grass, but they're actually choosing actively to eat the weeds. All livestock can be very, very effective weed eaters if we just give them the opportunity. And they get this opportunity by utilising stress-free stockmanship methods. Have a look at the way that they're choosing all sorts of different components for their diet. They're not being forced to eat the weeds, they're actually choosing to do so, and they're experimenting. For the first time in their lives, even though they've been on this property the whole of their lives, they are actively eating these weeds. There's 3 different types of thistles in this clip, and they're eating them all. When we look across and observe what the individual animals are doing, see how they're experimenting and learning. They're feeling out, how do I do this? How do I harvest this weed material? Because realise that almost all weeds are pretty high in some compounds that can't be found in the grasses and the regular pasture species. So if we give the animals this sort of an opportunity, then they will start to do the experimentation, which gives them the abilities to consume more of the weeds. In this part of the film, you can see the individual animals not only biting the bits off, but then manipulating the bits within their mouths, turning the thistle heads around so they can eat them. The ewe on the right is really very, very interested. She's getting great feedback from the fact that these weeds are nutritious, but she's learning, how do I harvest that? How do I manipulate my mouth? How can I strip it off? The ewe that's immediately beside her is also learning at the same time. She's observing what her friend's doing. And look at how effective, once they've had a little bit of practice, and how good they get at this. Those thistles have been stripped right back. If you look at them closely, they'll continue to work and work and work and get every bit of foliage that they possibly can off the thistles. What an impact they've had in a very, very short time on that area of weeds. The thistles are losing their competitive advantage. You can have this sort of an effect on weeds on your property if you use stress-free stockmanship.
Okay, so that pulls together several of the things we were talking about, and it also illustrates how animals are learning these skills that they need to actually forage efficiently on plants like a thistle. As I said earlier on, I had several examples that I was going to show related to developing foraging skills. You figure an animal has to eat, in case of a cow, a lot of food each day, and foraging skills matter a lot. And the ability to utilize a plant, if it's something that's hard to harvest, animals are going to ignore it relative to other plants unless they develop the skills. A last point here, I often get asked, what about grazing at high stock densities? Does that adversely affect the ability of animals to select foods and so forth? And certainly it can, but it depends on the skills of the person that's doing the grazing and their attentiveness to the animals and their needs. One of the things we saw when we were working with Ray Bannister in eastern Montana with what he refers to as boom-bust grazing, he was able to retrain his cattle herd to broaden out their selection patterns through managing grazing and grazing intensity and higher stock densities. And his cows learned to mix a variety of species, what we said, mix the best with the rest rather than eat the best and leave the rest. He was concerned about weeds like leafy spurge, increases in sagebrush, and some of the complementarities that we were talking about. For instance, just quickly, since we mentioned it, appetizer of bitterbrush helps animals use sagebrush. When animals are challenged to broaden out their diets, that can be a way to help teach them to utilize a broader array of plants and the benefits that can come from doing that. The last point I'll make is about biodiversity and individuality. I said already, there's no two individuals that are alike. And it's just striking when you look at individual animals and what they do, whether it's these lambs here, these 24 lambs offered a very simple choice between rolled barley and alfalfa pellets. You have everything from lamb number 1 that wants very little barley and mostly alfalfa all the way across here to one like 24 that loves barley and eats very much less of the alfalfa. Now, all these lambs were performing well over the couple of months we were doing this trial, but it's simply reflecting individuality. That same thing is true relative to ability to eat plants that are high in secondary compounds. For instance, intake of blackbrush, of these new twigs of blackbrush that are very, very high in tannins. 80% of the goats don't want anything to do with it, but another 10 to 20% eat them very, very readily. It's simply reflecting the ability of different animals to utilize different kinds of forages high in secondary compounds. When people at the Poisonous Plants Lab were looking at variation among breeds in ability to eat larkspur and susceptibility to larkspur toxicity from alkaloids in larkspur, there was more variation within a breed than among breeds. There's just tremendous variation, and that's something that people can build on and work with. And I know producers that run on endophyte infected tall fescue that have done just that. They've actually selected for cattle herd that has great ability to utilize, to not be adversely affected by the alkaloids in endophyte infected tall fescue. So let me summarize here by saying we stress genetics as the mechanism of evolution, and certainly genetics is important. The cartoon earthquakes are coming. Yep, the mysterious innate intuition of some animals. But what I've been trying to say as I've gone along too is certainly genes are important, but genes are being expressed in environments that's leading to individuality in animals, in ever-changing environments. And so try to get you appreciating that genes are dialoguing continually with social and biophysical environments and enabling animals to do things that as environments change, including eating weeds. I think throughout it all, what is important to realize is that organisms are creating relationships with what they deem are the relevant facets of the social and biophysical worlds they inhabit. I'm going to show you one last short video, and I'm not being respectful of your time, but just watch this video here of this oyster catcher and just think about what's going on here. So I love animal innovation, how animals figure things out and do things you'd never expect, like that oyster catcher learning to fish. How did it learn to do that? Well, foraging behaviors develop as a function of history, necessity, and chance, and they then can become part of the culture. Many years ago, when I was working with goats in blackbrush, had 6 different groups of goats on 6 different pastures. These goats here that you're looking at started to eat wood rat houses, and you think, oh my gosh, blackbrush is bad, but wood rat houses are even worse. Why did they do that? Well, if you look inside those houses, there are rooms, and one of the rooms is the bathroom, which is densely packed vegetation soaked in urine. What those goats had figured out was that that was a non-protein nitrogen supplement. And over the 3 months of that trial, the goats in that pasture did far better than the goats in the other 5 pastures because they had this protein supplement. How did that happen? Who knows? I teased the Einstein of the goat world was in that pasture. However it happened, the key point is that became a part of the culture of those goats, and they would do better on those landscapes, although the wood rats wouldn't do fare so well, but they would do better on those landscapes because they'd figured out a particular behavior. Of 18 groups of goats during 3 winters, that was the only group of goats that learned to eat wood rat houses. So thinking about cultures, the cultures of your animals, and how to create cultures that are locally and adapted to your conditions is, I think, really fundamentally important. And to realize in all of that, that animals aren't machines and genes aren't destiny. Animals are involved in the world, which helps them to evolve with the world. And with that, Larissa, and I apologize for going over here a ways, but that's it. I'll stop sharing here.
I'm going to share my screen really quickly. But thank you, Fred. That's, as always, such insightful examples and experience. Let me just share my screen just to give folks a chance. If you have any questions that you'd like to bring to our attention before we end, there are a couple that came in. One, there's been some interest in further discussion with you, Fred, and I actually sent an email to you already about control of the crown beard and wing stem. And so I can put you in touch with folks that might have some questions about about that.
And I'm really happy to do that, Larissa. I mean, one of the fun things looking back on that 10 years of Behave when we were working with livestock producers around the US and ultimately around the globe was just, taking on challenges like that, and all of us brainstorming, not just me, or all of us working together to try to figure out. It was very creative, and so it's I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. So yeah, if folks are interested in learning more about that, you can get in touch with me. Otherwise, I know who brought that to my attention. And then another question, someone says, many of us on this call are grazing non-native Eastern managed pasture that we can control the species mix within it. Are there resources to help decide what we should include in the grazing mix to take advantage of the complementaries between phytochemicals, et cetera? Or is it maximizing diversity enough to accomplish this?
Very good question. I think trying to maximize diversity is great. Is a great way to do that. Jerry Bernetti, and many people may remember Jerry died of cancer several years ago, but when we were doing all of this work, he wrote a paper for Acres USA, and he was saying, a lot of these things that we see as weed species can be beneficial based on work that we were doing. And so he's encouraging people to do that, to encourage diversity in their pastures. Now, having said that, there's some just fascinating work going on with sheep and cattle in New Zealand and in the US, and I'm going to send you some of those papers, Larissa. I'll send you some. People don't have to read, but they're talking about different species and different combinations and functional diversity. And I talk about, animals will sample 50 to 75 species and so forth. I don't want people to get thinking, how do you do that? Because in these studies, a handful of species, if it's functional kind of diversity, can be really huge for animals and for the quality of meat and dairy for human consumption. So I'm going to send you papers related to all of that, because of those linkages ultimately that, health of soil, health of plant diversity, health of animals, and health of humans. So yeah, very good question. I'll send you those papers and you can share them. If people don't have to read these things, obviously, but if you're interested, you'll have access.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And Fred, yeah, you're so good at making those connections. I mean, it's amazing. We've gotten a lot of good feedback. People are saying what an interesting, important presentation. So I just want to pass that along to you, Fred. I did pop a poll up on the screen for folks just to give us some feedback on their experience. So while I'm finishing up, feel free, those of you that are still out there, to complete it. But let me just do a little bit of housekeeping before we officially sign off. Recording of this webinar and the slides will be available either later this afternoon or tomorrow. I'm going to be sending out an email, so keep an eye out for that. And also it's going to be posted on our website and YouTube. And if there are other resources, I will send those along as well. If not tonight, then in the future. We also do have some other good webinars coming up. I'll send links to those for registration and other opportunities in my follow-up email, including our mentorship program that we're still accepting applications for a couple more weeks. And then I'll also tell folks that we are expecting to open our grants application next week. So that will be an exciting time as well. I am really, it's been wonderful to have you with us again, Fred. I posted in the chat that we do have we have 3 webinars from a couple years ago that we hosted with Fred. So I'll put those in my email so folks can find those. But as always, it's really lovely to have you on, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to have all the knowledge and insight that you've gathered in your work and that you share so freely. I hope that, at some point we'll have another chance to collaborate. And I thank you to everyone else in the audience. It's been really wonderful to have you stick around and have great questions and just your interest in this topic and all your hard work with your animals and keeping in your communities. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks to you, Larissa, and all the people who attended. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, Fred. I hope that we all are able to connect again soon, and everyone has a good rest of your Wednesday. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.